2 weeks ago, we looked at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. 4 points that Paul makes there about the second coming of Christ, among which one of the things that Paul says about the second coming is that it's going to be comprehensive. What about those who are already dead, those who have died in Christ? That's what Paul answers. Where are they now? Right now, where are the dead? Are they in heaven right now in the presence of God? Or are they somewhere else? And I believe that the Bible gives a clear answer to that question. And so I want us to begin by looking at the passage that Brother George read to us just a moment ago, and that's Luke chapter 16, verses 22 and 23. This is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, we call it a parable, but there are a few good reasons to believe that it's not a parable, that it actually happened, and that Jesus is teaching us some things about life after death. Now, in the case with the rich man, Jesus' point is, once you get on the other side of death, there is no changing the situation. It's appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 9 and verse 27. But here the question is, where are the dead? And notice again, chapter 16 of Luke, verses 22 and 23. Jesus said, the poor man, that is Lazarus, died, and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. That was a beautiful place to be in the mind of the Jews, because Abraham was the father of the Jewish nation. And so Jesus says, Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died. Everybody dies. Assuming that Jesus does not come back during our lifetime, every one of us will have our family and friends assembled around the coffin at our funeral one day. Every one of us. We all understand that. Everybody dies. Rich man also died and was buried in Hades. The text says he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. Brother George read from the King James Version, which translates that word literally. He was in torments, plural. That would be a discussion for another time. And he saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. And so here Jesus teaches us that Lazarus is in Hades. Now, the King James Version translates the word hell. I'm going to point out other translations and what they say in just a moment, but I don't believe hell is a good translation here, and I'll proceed to tell you why. But the New American Standard and other translations say that he was in Hades. That is the Greek word, Hades. We'll define that in just a moment. So the rich man who was selfish in this life steps across the threshold of death, and he is in Hades. And Jesus goes on to define it as being in torments. So much so that he asked Abraham to send Lazarus to just dip his finger in water and touch the tip of his tongue. He is in such great pain and agony. Keep your finger here, Luke chapter 16, and we'll come back to it in just a moment, and turn over to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 is the first gospel sermon preached after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the Apostle Peter is trying to persuade the Jews that Jesus is the Savior, the Son of God, based upon his resurrection from the dead. And he quotes from Psalm chapter 16 to show that the resurrection was predicted by David in the book of Psalms. Now I want you to pay attention to what David says, or what Peter rather says, in verse 27 of Acts chapter 2. Quoting from Psalm 16, because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay. That's what David said in Psalm 16 when he's predicting the resurrection of Christ, that he will not leave his soul in Hades. If you jump down to verse 31, Peter says that David looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. So, contrast those 2 points there from Luke chapter 16 and Acts chapter 2. Luke chapter 16, the rich man went to Hades. Acts chapter 2, Peter says that Jesus went to Hades. Both the rich man and Jesus were in Hades at one time. Now, the word Hades really simply means the dwelling place of the dead. If you looked up the Greek word in the Greek dictionaries, that's how it defines Hades, the dwelling place of the dead. Now, we understand the Bible teaches that there's a part of us that goes on after death, a part of us that is not physical. In our Wednesday night Bible class, in fact, this particular Wednesday night, we'll look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 29 through the end of the chapter, where the Apostle Paul talks about the fact that this body is going to be changed at death. In the twinkling of an eye. There's going to be some continuity between this life and this physical body and the spiritual body, but they're going to be different. This is a physical body, we're going to put on a spiritual body. So right now we see that Jesus is in the same place as the rich man. Well, go back now and look at Luke chapter 16 again. Back in Luke chapter 16 and verse 22, Jesus says that the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. Abraham's bosom. Now that is the positive side, is it not, of this unseen world. Lazarus is also in the unseen world. He also is in the dwelling place of the dead. He's in the place called Hades. But he's in a place that is positive. He's in a place where Jesus calls Abraham's bosom. And so we see from these two passages that Hades is divided up into two different places. There's the positive side where Jesus went, because Jesus didn't go to hell. But Jesus did go to Hades. He went to the dwelling place of the dead for 3 days. He went to the place where he calls here in Luke chapter 16, Abraham's bosom. The same place where Lazarus was. So the unseen world, Hades, has two different places. It has a place that is positive, where Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom and where Jesus went. His body was buried in the grave, but his spirit went to the dwelling place of the dead, to Hades, Peter says in Acts chapter 2. But the rich man also went to Hades, but he was in torments in Hades. He was in a bad place in Hades. And so, when I looked at different translations of this word Hades, I saw where the different translators had different conceptions of what this place is. Now, these translations, and these are 4 different languages: English, Romanian, French, and Spanish. How did these translators view this word? And there were a handful of them, probably based on Luke chapter 16, where Jesus says that the rich man was in torments, translated the word Hades there as hell. Because that's what we think of. When we think of torments, we think of hell. But that's not, again, what the word means. The word means dwelling place of the dead. And there's a host of translations that translate it that way. And then you might use a few translations that simply don't define the word. What they do is they transliterate it. In other words, they take the Greek letters of that word and they assign the English letters to make it an English word. Hades is a Greek word, but we just transliterate it, keep it in English, and say, well, that's Hades. Well, that's one way of translating it, but it's kind of the easy way out. It's like saying, well, I don't know what the word is, so I'll just keep the same word. We won't define it. Well, I turned over and looked at Acts chapter 2. And this is how the translators translate the word in Luke chapter 16. How do they translate it in Acts chapter 2? Because that's where Jesus went, right? But Jesus didn't go to hell. He didn't go to torments, as the King James and the Romanian Orthodox translation translate. No, that's not where Jesus went. Jesus went to the dwelling place of the dead, as we've already pointed out. Again, some translations simply transliterate and keep the word the same. But then there are some translations, like the Contemporary English Version and NIV translates the word as grave. And yet that's not where Jesus went either. His body went to the grave, yes, but his spirit did not. His spirit didn't go to the tomb. His spirit went to the spiritual world, to the dwelling place of the dead. Let's back up again. let's take a look at this place that is called Hades. In Luke chapter 16, Jesus refers to it as Abraham's bosom. Now, the word Hades is used in the Bible 10 times. And if you didn't pick up a handout on the table in the foyer, I've got the verses listed there on the handout if you'd like to pick one up on the way home so you can read the verses that use the word Hades. And so Jesus calls this positive place of Hades Abraham's bosom. But if you look at Luke chapter 23, Jesus gives it another designation. In Luke chapter 23 is where Jesus is hanging on the cross. And at first, the thieves, the robbers, the murderers that were crucified, one on his right hand and one on his left, were mocking him just like the people down below. And they were making fun of him. But at some point during those few hours that Jesus spent on the cross, one of the thieves had a change of heart, and he was penitent. And he told the other thief, he says, "We are getting what we deserve, and yet this man has done nothing wrong." And he tells Jesus, he says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And you recall what Jesus said. Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Paradise. Well, Jesus didn't go to where the Father is. He didn't go to where we understand heaven. He didn't go to heaven, so he wasn't using the word paradise to refer to heaven. He was using paradise to refer to the positive place of the Hadean world, the unseen world. And so when Jesus died, his spirit went to the unseen world, the dwelling place of the dead, and the spirit of the thief also went to the unseen Hadean world. Jesus' body was buried in the tomb of Joseph. The thief's body was taken off the cross and buried probably with a bunch of other criminals in a common grave. Their bodies were in two different places, but their spirits were in the same place. At least for those 3 days until Jesus rose from the dead. But now this bottom place also has another designation. Turn over to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. Tartarus is a Greek word that refers to the bad place. Paradise refers to the good place of Hades. Tartarus refers to the bad side of Hades. This is the only time this word is used in the New Testament, and yet from the context it's clear that this place is temporary. It's not referring to hell, the dwelling place of the devil, or the place of punishment of the devil. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4. The Apostle Peter writes, "If God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell." Now this is not the normal word for hell. We'll get to that in just a moment. This is a word that's used only one time, and that's Tartarus. "But cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness." Notice these last 3 words. "Reserved for judgment." So this bottom place, we might call, of the Hadean world, the place where the rich man went, is the place where disobedient angels are also being in torment, reserved for the coming judgment. Okay, I hope you're with me now. We step over the threshold of death. We're either prepared or unprepared to be with God. If we're prepared to be with God in Jesus Christ, then we enter into the place that Jesus on the cross calls paradise. Luke chapter 16 calls Abraham's bosom. It's the pleasant side of the dwelling place of the dead, reserved for judgment. If we step across the threshold of death and we are not prepared to stand before God on the day of judgment, we are not immersed into the blood of Christ, then we enter the bad place of the Hadean world. Tartarus, torments, reserved for judgment. Let's move on and look at a few other things. Notice these facts that we've looked at relative to Christ in the Hadean world. First of all, Christ went to Hades. He went to the dwelling place of the dead, Acts chapter 2, verses 27 to 31. Christ also went to paradise, he himself says in Luke chapter 23 and verse 43. So there is a part of the Hadean world that is equivalent to paradise,